A young Augustinian monk hammers 95 theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg on an October morning in 1517. Martin Luther intends nothing more than academic debate, but his simple act shatters the spiritual monopoly that has ruled Europe for 1,000 years. Within months, printing presses across the German states flood markets with pamphlets bearing his revolutionary ideas. Salvation comes through faith alone, not through indulgences, pilgrimages, and papal authority that has enriched Rome while impoverishing souls. German princes discover that Luther's Reformation offers irresistible opportunities for political liberation. Why submit to Italian bishops or transfer German gold to Roman coffers when Scripture itself questions papal supremacy? The message spreads through territories where local rulers have long chafed under imperial control, finding in Reformed theology the perfect justification for princely independence. The Peasants' War erupts across southern Germany 5 years after Luther's initial protest. Desperate farmers and craftsmen rise against lords who have crushed them beneath impossible burdens of taxation and service. They march under banners inscribed with biblical verses, believing that the same God who freed souls from papal bondage will liberate bodies from aristocratic oppression. Thomas Müntzer preaches revolution from pulpits, declaring that Christ's kingdom demands earthly justice as well as heavenly salvation. Luther recoils as his theological reformation spawns social revolution. When the uprising spreads to his own Saxony, threatening the very nobility that protects him from imperial wrath, Luther pens savage pamphlets urging princes to stab, smite, and slay the rebellious peasants like mad dogs. His brutal rhetoric helps justify the slaughter that follows. Over 100,000 peasants butchered by noble armies that show no mercy to those who dare claim divine authority for earthly rebellion. The bloody suppression teaches German princes a crucial lesson. Reformation must serve political order, not threaten it. They embrace Lutheran theology not as revolutionary doctrine, but as state religion, carefully controlled and directed by secular authority. Yet the precedent remains dangerous. If Scripture can justify resistance to papal authority, it might someday sanction resistance to imperial power as well. Charles V spends decades trying to contain the spreading infection of heresy through military force and diplomatic compromise. His armies march across Germany, winning victories at Mühlberg and other battlefields where imperial discipline overwhelms reformed enthusiasm. Yet every military triumph proves temporary. Burned cities rebuild themselves around Lutheran churches, and defeated princes retreat to await more favorable circumstances. The Peace of Augsburg acknowledges what imperial might cannot change: the permanent division of German Christianity. Signed in the summer of 1555, the treaty establishes the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, allowing each prince to choose between traditional and reformed faiths for his territories. Subjects must conform to their ruler's faith or face exile, a harsh but practical solution to the problem of spiritual diversity within political unity. Augsburg's settlement contains fatal flaws that time will expose. The treaty recognizes only the old faith and Lutheranism, deliberately excluding the third force that increasingly threatens both established churches, Calvinism. John Calvin's austere theology, radiating outward from Geneva, attracts princes and peoples who find Lutheran compromises insufficiently pure, Roman traditions too corrupt. The French-born reformer preaches predestination with mathematical precision. God has chosen the elect before time began, their salvation absolutely certain, their earthly success a visible sign of divine favor. Calvinist communities spring up across Europe, with disciplined organization that neither papal hierarchy nor Lutheran princely control can match. In France, they become the Huguenots, building a state within a state. In the Netherlands, they fuel resistance against Spanish rule. In Scotland, John Knox imports Geneva's stern theology and strict morality. Throughout the German lands, Calvinist princes like Frederick III of the Palatinate embrace the Reformed faith, knowing that Augsburg's exclusion of their doctrine provides enemies with legal justification for future attack. The Calvinist challenge proves particularly dangerous because it combines theological certainty with political organization. Where Lutherans generally submit to princely authority and traditionalists defer to hierarchical custom, Calvinists develop theories of resistance that justify rebellion against ungodly rulers. They create disciplined communities bound together by shared conviction rather than mere territorial loyalty. Their presence transforms Germany's spiritual map from a simple Rome-Wittenberg division into a three-way competition where each faith claims exclusive truth. The old church responds to reformist challenge with its own revolutionary transformation. The Council of Trent, meeting intermittently from 1545 to 1563, clarifies papal doctrine with unprecedented precision while launching the Counter-Reformation that will reclaim millions of souls for Rome. Where medieval Christianity often tolerated local variations and theological ambiguity, Tridentine orthodoxy demands absolute conformity to centrally defined doctrine. The new catechism leaves no room for doubt. The Index of Forbidden Books eliminates dangerous ideas. The Roman Inquisition roots out heretical deviation. Jesuit missionaries become shock troops of papal renewal, combining intellectual sophistication with evangelical fervor as they reconquer territories lost to Reformed error. Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises forge priests whose disciplined devotion matches Calvinist certainty while remaining absolutely obedient to Roman authority. They establish schools throughout traditional Europe, educating noble sons in revitalized orthodoxy while winning popular affection through charitable works. The Spanish monarchy becomes the old faith's secular sword, wielding unprecedented power across a European empire where the sun never sets. Philip II rules Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, vast American territories, and the riches of the Philippine trade. His Austrian cousins control Bohemia and Hungary, while wearing the imperial crown that makes them overlord of Germany's traditional princes. Together, they command resources that dwarf any possible reformed coalition, yet they face the eternal Spanish dilemma: global responsibilities that scatter their strength across too many frontiers. Spanish silver from American mines funds royal armies, but the same wealth that enables Habsburg power also fuels the inflation that destabilizes European society. Prices rise relentlessly as New World precious metals flood European markets, destroying traditional relationships between lords and peasants, employers and workers, creditors and debtors. The economic revolution proves as disruptive as the spiritual reformation, creating new classes of winners and losers who view each other with suspicion and resentment. Reformed princes watch Spanish wealth with growing alarm, recognizing that Madrid's gold and German guns could combine to crush their movement throughout Europe. They begin forming defensive alliances like the Schmalkaldic League, seeking foreign assistance from France and England despite the awkwardness of reformed papal cooperation against royal Spanish power. Theology and politics become hopelessly entangled as spiritual differences merge with territorial ambitions, dynastic rivalries, and commercial competition. France occupies the crucial position in this developing crisis, officially papal yet persistently anti-Spanish. French kings may hear mass and persecute Huguenots, but they cannot tolerate Madrid's domination of Europe's periphery. Spain to the south, the German lands to the east, the Netherlands to the north. The logic of raison d'etat that places French national interest above spiritual solidarity already operates as French diplomats secretly encourage reformed resistance to imperial authority. The Dutch Revolt, beginning in 1566, provides the first full-scale preview of the confessional political wars that will later devastate Germany. The reformed Netherlands rebellion against Spanish rule combines Calvinist theology with economic grievance, local patriotism with constitutional tradition. Spanish attempts to impose both spiritual uniformity and fiscal centralization trigger resistance that grows from urban riots into organized warfare. The conflict drags on for decades, bleeding Spanish resources while demonstrating that theological conviction can sustain military resistance far longer than mere political grievance. English involvement complicates the European balance as Elizabeth III gradually abandons her initial neutrality to support reformed causes across the continent. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and English naval raids on Spanish commerce signal England's emergence as a major player in the struggle between Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Confessional solidarity begins trumping traditional diplomatic calculations as reformed and papal powers increasingly view each other as existential threats. Imperial constitutional structure transforms spiritual division into permanent political crisis. The Golden Bull grants 7 electors, 3 archbishops and 4 secular princes, the power to choose each new ruler, creating a system where theological balance determines political control. As reformed conversion changes the electoral college's composition, each imperial election becomes a referendum on Germany's spiritual future. Traditional rulers face reformed majorities that block their initiatives, while reformed princes fear papal sympathizers will use central authority to impose orthodoxy. Rudolf II's reign epitomizes the growing dysfunction of central government. The melancholy ruler retreats to his Prague castle during the 1680s and 1690s, surrounding himself with astrologers, alchemists, and artists, while neglecting the administrative duties that effective rule requires. His mental instability mirrors the realm's political paralysis, as traditional and reformed princes pursue increasingly incompatible goals. The imperial diet meets less frequently and accomplishes fewer objectives. Central law becomes unenforceable, as local rulers claim theological justification for ignoring authority. The succession crisis that follows Rudolf's death exposes the full fragility of imperial institutions. The Styrian Archduke, Rudolf's designated heir, represents militant counter-Reformation orthodoxy of the most uncompromising sort. Educated by Jesuits, he has already expelled reformers from his Austrian hereditary lands with ruthless efficiency. His coronation promises similar treatment for reformed Germany, a prospect that terrifies Lutheran princes who remember how Spanish armies crushed heresy in the Netherlands. Reformed fears intensify as the new ruler demonstrates his theological militancy through increasingly aggressive policies. The Donauwörth incident provides a disturbing preview of future intentions when imperial troops occupy the Free City during 1607 to restore traditional worship practices. Reformed princes interpret this intervention as a violation of Augsburg's settlement, evidence that Vienna intends to reverse the Reformation through systematic use of central authority. The formation of competing military alliances signals that diplomacy has reached its limits. Reformed princes create the union under Frederick IV of the Palatinate the following year, promising mutual defense against papal aggression. Traditional princes respond with the League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria during 1609, determined to preserve the old faith against further reformist encroachment. Each alliance seeks foreign support. The Union courts France and England. The League relies on Spain and the Pope, internationalizing what began as German domestic disputes. Banking innovations developed in Italian city-states and Dutch commercial centers revolutionize European warfare by enabling rulers to borrow against future revenues on unprecedented scales. The Fugger banking house of Augsburg finances Austrian operations across Europe, while Amsterdam's money markets fund Dutch resistance. War becomes as much about credit ratings as battlefield courage, creating new dependencies between rulers and financiers that will reshape European politics for centuries. Military revolution accompanies financial innovation as armies adopt new weapons, tactics, and organizational structures. The Spanish tercio, dense formations of pikemen supported by musketeers, dominates European battlefields, but Swedish and Dutch military reformers experiment with more flexible arrangements that promise to neutralize Spanish advantages. Artillery grows more powerful and mobile. Fortification science develops elaborate geometric designs. Professional officer corps replace feudal levies with disciplined troops who fight for pay rather than personal loyalty. Economic transformation proves equally disruptive as traditional agricultural society gives way to more complex commercial relationships. Urban merchants accumulate capital that challenges aristocratic land-based wealth. Rural peasants migrate to cities seeking better opportunities. Artisan guilds struggle against new forms of manufacturing that threaten established privileges. Theological reformation often provides the ideological framework for these social and economic changes, creating additional sources of conflict within already divided communities. Confessional communities struggle with conflicting loyalties as war forces choices between spiritual principles and political commitments. Pacifist groups find their communities divided between those who support causes through non-military contributions and those who view any assistance to war-making as violation of divine law. Traditional clergy, many educated in established centers and financially dependent on customary connections, generally counsel loyalty to established authority, while their congregations increasingly embrace resistance. Native populations throughout the German realm generally support whatever authority offers better protection against expansion and taxation. This creates complex alliances that provide various powers with valuable assets, while forcing commanders to defend multiple frontiers simultaneously. Raids on exposed settlements drain resources needed for main campaigns, while demonstrating that any major conflict will cost more than most initially imagine. Women assume responsibilities previously reserved for men, managing estates and businesses while their husbands serve in growing armies or diplomatic missions. Children too young for military service contribute by manufacturing supplies, gathering intelligence, and maintaining communications between communities. The coming transformation will accelerate changes already reshaping European society in ways that extend far beyond immediate political transformations. As the second decade of the 17th century progresses, these tensions converge in Bohemia, where the Styrian succession to the imperial throne threatens the delicate spiritual balance that has maintained an uneasy peace. Reformed Bohemian nobles face the choice between accepting a militantly traditional ruler or risking everything in resistance that might trigger the continental war that everyone fears, yet no one seems able to prevent. Dawn breaks grey and cold over Prague Castle on the 23rd of May, 1618. In the great halls where Rudolph II once collected mechanical wonders and alchemical mysteries, Czech nobles gather with faces grim as winter stone. Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn adjusts his sword belt and surveys his companions, men whose grandfathers fought at Mühlberg, whose fathers embraced Luther's reforms, whose sons will inherit either freedom or chains depending on what transpires in the next few hours. The crisis has been building since Rudolph's death 8 years earlier, when the childless monarch expired in his cluttered chambers, surrounded by astrolabes and hermetic texts. The crown passed to his brother Matthias, then to the Styrian archduke upon Matthias's death the previous spring. Each succession has tightened the theological noose around Protestant necks, but the Austrian ruler represents something far more dangerous than mere dynastic accident. He embodies the militant counter-reformation in its purest, most uncompromising form. The Letter of Majesty haunts these deliberations like a ghost demanding justice. Rudolph granted this charter back in the summer of 1609, guaranteeing Czech nobles the right to build churches and practice Protestant worship across their domains. The document bears the royal seal and Rudolph's signature, making it sacred law that binds all future rulers. Yet the new monarch's representatives have spent months explaining why circumstances have changed, why old promises no longer apply, why the greater good requires sacrificing particular privileges. Jaroslav Božita, Zmartinich, and Vilém Slavata arrive at the castle shortly after sunrise, their faces betraying no awareness that death stalks their footsteps. As the Archduke's chief lieutenants in Prague, they have spent the winter implementing policies that make their master's intentions unmistakable. Protestant churches close their doors as royal commissioners declare them illegal. Lutheran ministers flee to Saxon exile as Jesuit priests arrive with government escorts. The systematic campaign reaches its climax when commissioners order the destruction of churches at Brumov and Hrob, built according to rites guaranteed by Rudolph's charter. Count Thurn leads the procession via Prague Castle's labyrinthine corridors, past tapestries depicting ancient Czech glories and portraits of kings who ruled before the Austrian dynasty arrived to claim their inheritance. The nobles' boots echo on stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of supplicants seeking royal favour, though this morning's visitors come not to beg, but to demand. They carry themselves like men who have already chosen death over dishonour, understanding that retreat from this confrontation means permanent submission to foreign tyranny. The meeting convenes in the council chamber, where the estates have traditionally negotiated with their monarchs, a room designed to emphasize royal majesty while acknowledging noble privilege. Martinic and Slavata take their places behind a heavy oak table, flanked by Secretary Philip Fabricius, whose nervous fidgeting suggests he grasps the morning's dangerous currents better than his masters. Sunlight streams across tall windows, illuminating dust motes that dance like spirits of the coming storm. Count Thurn speaks first, his voice carrying the authority of ancient bloodlines and recent grievances. The estates demand explanation for violations of the Letter of Majesty, compensation for destroyed churches, and guarantees that the new king will respect his predecessor's commitments. His words are formal, courteous, diplomatic, the final attempt to resolve constitutional crisis using traditional means. Yet everyone present understands that these negotiations represent theatre, not genuine diplomacy. The Archduke's representatives have their instructions. The nobles have made their choice. Martinic responds with bureaucratic precision, explaining legal technicalities that transform sacred promises into mere suggestions. The churches at Brumov and Hrob were built on ecclesiastical land, making them subject to different regulations. Changed circumstances require policy adjustments. The realm's spiritual health takes precedence over particular privileges. His arguments are legally sophisticated and morally bankrupt, the kind of reasoning that sacrifices justice to convenience while claiming divine sanction for human ambition. The chamber grows increasingly tense as noble after noble voices, objections that fall on deliberately deaf ears. These men represent the flower of Czech society, the Kinsky family with their vast estates, the Colorado clan with their military traditions, the Schlick dynasty with their mining wealth. Their ancestors created this kingdom's glory. Their descendants will inherit whatever freedom remains after today's choices. They speak for towns and villages throughout the realm, where Protestant communities await news from Prague, with prayers on their lips and weapons in their hands. Count Adam Erdmann, Turchka von Lippe, rises slowly, his scarred face bearing witness to battles fought in Hungary versus Ottoman armies. His words cut across diplomatic pretense like a cavalry saber cutting silk. The ruler's commissioners have betrayed every promise, violated every tradition, insulted every noble family in the kingdom. The Styrian duke may wear crowns, but he has forfeited any claim to Czech loyalty by means of systematic treachery that reduces ancient privileges to worthless parchment. The moment crystallizes around a single, terrible choice. Slavata attempts to defend royal policies with increasingly desperate explanations, but his voice wavers as he recognizes the futility of persuasion. These nobles have not come to negotiate, but to deliver an ultimatum disguised as conversation. Their grievances run deeper than church buildings or legal technicalities. They challenge the fundamental relationship between ruler and ruled that the new policies have poisoned beyond repair. Count Jindřich Matyáš Thurn delivers the estate's final verdict with quiet fury that makes the chamber walls seem to close inward. The Archduke has broken faith with the kingdom. The kingdom therefore owes him no allegiance. The ancient compact between crown and nobility lies shattered, destroyed by a foreign prince who values theological uniformity above constitutional tradition. If his representatives cannot acknowledge this truth, perhaps a more dramatic lesson will clarify the situation. The violence erupts with shocking suddenness. Noble hands seize royal shoulders, dragging Martinic and Slavata toward the tall windows that overlook the castle courtyard 70 feet below. Fabricius attempts to flee, but finds himself caught in the same inexorable current that sweeps his masters toward their appointment with gravity. The three men struggle desperately as hands tear at their elaborate court dress, destroying the symbols of authority they have used to justify tyranny. Martinic goes first, his scream lost in the morning wind as he plummets toward the courtyard's cobblestones. Slavata follows an instant later, his body tumbling across space like a broken doll, cast aside by an angry child. Fabricius makes a final desperate grab for the window frame, before noble hands break his grip and send him after his companions. The defenestration of Prague lasts perhaps 30 seconds, but those moments transform European history by demonstrating that constitutional crisis admits no diplomatic solution. The three men survive their fall by landing in soft refuse piled beneath the castle walls, though their dignity suffers mortal wounds that will never heal. Martinic and Slavata flee the kingdom within hours, carrying news of noble rebellion to the Archduke's court in Vienna. Their survival disappoints many rebels who hoped for a cleaner solution to the problem of royal authority. But alive or dead, the ruler's representatives have received a message that requires no translation. The realm rejects Austrian rule. News of the defenestration spreads around Prague, like wildfire spreading across summer grain. Protestant congregations gather in their threatened churches to offer prayers of thanksgiving for noble courage that has saved their souls from papist contamination. Craft guilds abandon their workshops to demonstrate support for estates that have dared challenge royal tyranny. University students march along narrow streets singing hymns that blend spiritual devotion with political defiance. The city discovers that rebellion tastes sweeter than submission, however dangerous the consequences. Count Thurn assumes leadership of the revolutionary government with reluctant determination, understanding that successful rebellion requires more than dramatic gestures. The estates must organize military defense versus the Archduke's inevitable retaliation, while seeking foreign allies who might provide the resources necessary for sustained resistance. The kingdom cannot stand alone, opposing the combined might of Austria and Spain. Survival depends on transforming local revolt into international coalition. The revolutionary regime immediately dispatches envoys to courts throughout Protestant Europe, seeking assistance from rulers who share the kingdom's theological commitments, if not its political situation. Frederick V of the Palatinate emerges as the most promising potential ally, combining Protestant orthodoxy with significant territorial resources and family connections to major European dynasties. His marriage to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of England's James I, suggests the possibility of English support that could tip the balance opposing Austrian power. Military preparations proceed with desperate urgency, as intelligence reports confirm the Archduke's mobilization throughout his hereditary domains. Austrian regiments march toward Czech borders, while Jesuit preachers declare holy war versus heretical rebels who have dared assault God's anointed representatives. The Counter-Reformation reveals its militant face as theological argument yields to military force, proving that the new ruler prefers conquest to compromise. Czech forces gather under commanders whose experience fighting Ottoman armies in Hungary provides valuable preparation for the different but equally deadly challenge of civil war. These veterans understand siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and the logistics of sustained campaigning. But they also recognize the enormous disadvantages facing revolutionary armies that must defend fixed territories, opposing professional forces fighting with royal resources. The estates face an agonizing decision about the crown itself. Ancient law requires them to elect a new king if they reject the Archduke's authority, but choosing a replacement involves enormous risks that could transform local revolt into dynastic war. Foreign princes might provide military resources, but would also pursue their own agendas that might conflict with Czech interests. Native nobles lack the international connections necessary for effective resistance opposing Austrian power. Frederick of the Palatinate arrives in Prague during the autumn of 1619 to accept the crown that the estates offer with desperate hope and hidden reservations. The young Calvinist prince brings genuine theological commitment and sincere desire to defend Protestant Christianity versus papal aggression. But he also carries the burden of naive optimism that underestimates the forces arrayed opposing his new kingdom. His coronation ceremonies blend ancient Czech traditions with Protestant simplicity, creating symbolic harmony that cannot overcome strategic weaknesses. The Winter King, as history will mockingly remember Frederick, establishes his court in Prague Castle, with touching confidence that divine providence will reward righteous resistance versus tyrannical authority. His English queen, Elizabeth, brings glamour and international prestige that temporarily obscures the coalition's fundamental military weakness. Their court becomes a beacon for Protestant nobility throughout Europe, though beacons often attract unwanted attention from those who prefer darkness. The Archduke's response combines political sophistication with military ruthlessness. Rather than attempting immediate reconquest, which might fail and encourage further rebellions, he carefully assembles overwhelming force while isolating the kingdom diplomatically. Spanish gold, finances, the recruitment of professional armies, while Jesuit diplomacy convinces potential Czech allies to remain neutral. The Austrian strategy aims at decisive victory that will discourage future challenges to Habsburg authority. The League mobilizes with enthusiasm that reflects both theological conviction and political calculation. Maximilian of Bavaria sees opportunity to strengthen his dynasty's position within the system while serving the cause of Orthodox faith. His disciplined armies march eastward with professional competence that contrasts sharply with Czech improvisation, though Bavarian soldiers carry more than military expertise. They bear the confidence of men fighting for established order versus revolutionary chaos. Spanish intervention tilts the balance, decisively opposing Czech independence. Troops march north from Habsburg territories in Italy, while diplomats coordinate strategy with Vienna to ensure that rebel defeat becomes complete rather than merely temporary. Philip III recognizes that Czech success might inspire similar revolts in the Netherlands or other Spanish domains, where Protestant minorities chafe under Orthodox rule. The campaign of 1620 unfolds with grim inevitability as the Archduke's coalition advances into the kingdom from multiple directions. Frederick's forces attempt to defend prepared positions, while hoping that foreign assistance will arrive before royal superiority becomes overwhelming. Yet the promised aid from England never materializes. French support remains purely diplomatic, and other Protestant powers prove unwilling to risk their own security for Czech freedom. Winter settles over Central Europe as opposing armies prepare for the decisive confrontation that will determine the realm's fate and perhaps the future of Protestant Christianity throughout the Austrian domains. The rebels have chosen their path. The loyalists have marshaled their strength. Only battle can resolve the constitutional crisis that diplomatic negotiation has failed to address. The stage is set for White Mountain, where the dreams of a Protestant kingdom will either triumph or die in the snow-covered fields outside Prague. The coming clash will prove that courage without resources leads to martyrdom rather than victory, that theological conviction cannot substitute for military competence, and that successful rebellion requires more than righteous anger to overcome the accumulated advantages of established power. The Winter King's brief reign approaches its bitter end, taking with it the hopes of those who believed that God's providence guaranteed victory to his chosen people. Snow crunches beneath cavalry hooves as Austrian forces wheel around the White Mountain, their banners snapping in the November wind of 1620. The battle lasts barely 2 hours before Frederick's army disintegrates, Protestant dreams dissolving into the chaos of panicked retreat. The Winter King flees Prague so hastily that his dinner grows cold on palace tables, earning him eternal mockery as a coward who abandoned his crown for his life. Papal bells ring across Vienna as news arrives of the crushing victory that restores the Styrian Archduke's authority and sends a clear message to anyone contemplating similar resistance. The reconquest of the Czech lands proves swift and merciless. The ruler's commissioners arrive in Prague with lists of nobles marked for execution, exile, or financial ruin. 27 Protestant leaders meet their deaths in the Old Town Square during the summer of 1621, their heads displayed on pikes as warnings to anyone harboring rebellious thoughts. The estate's property faces systematic confiscation, redistributed to papal loyalists who will ensure future submission to Austrian authority. Lutheran churches close permanently, while Jesuit colleges open to educate a new generation in Orthodox obedience. The devastation extends far beyond Prague's ancient walls. Across the Czech countryside, Protestant ministers flee to Saxon territories or face imprisonment in royal dungeons. Libraries containing centuries of Hussite theological writings burn in public squares while their owners watch helplessly. The University of Prague undergoes complete transformation as papal professors replace heretical scholars, ensuring that future Czech intellectuals learn to think correctly about matters spiritual and temporal. Yet the Archduke's triumph carries seeds of future catastrophe. The brutal suppression horrifies Protestant princes throughout the Germanic territories, convincing them that compromise with papal militancy leads inevitably to their own destruction. If ancient Czech liberties can vanish overnight, what protection do Saxon privileges or Hessian autonomy possess when confronted by the same overwhelming force? The White Mountain victory that was meant to end rebellion instead spreads fear across Protestant regions like plague carried by fleeing refugees. The Northern King watches these developments from his palace in Copenhagen with growing alarm and opportunistic calculation. Christian IV has spent decades building his realm into the dominant Baltic power, controlling the sound tolls that fund his military ambitions, while his navy patrols northern waters, where Swedish and Polish ships dare not venture without permission. The collapse of Protestant resistance in Central Europe threatens this carefully constructed hegemony by strengthening Austrian power precisely when northern expansion requires Austrian weakness. The monarch's intervention springs from motives far more complex than theological solidarity. As Duke of Holstein, the ruler holds territories within the Holy Roman Empire that could face the same fate as Czech estates if papal resurgence continues unchecked. His younger sons need employment befitting royal blood, and German bishoprics secularized during the Reformation offer perfect opportunities for ambitious princes. Most importantly, Bremen and Verden, wealthy North German territories, await conquest by whoever possesses sufficient force to seize them from their current ecclesiastical rulers. Protestant fears crystallize around the Edict of Restitution that Ferdinand promulgates in March of 1629. The decree commands the return of all church lands secularized since the Peace of Augsburg, a staggering transfer of wealth that would strip Protestant princes of territories they have controlled for generations. Entire cities that embraced the Reformation find themselves declared illegally possessed by heretical rulers who must surrender their prizes to rightful papal ownership. The edict threatens to undo 70 years of Protestant gains while enriching the very papal institutions that Protestant theology condemns as corrupt. The scale of threatened confiscation defies comprehension. Bremen, Magdeburg, and Halberstadt, three of Northern Europe's richest archbishoprics, must return to papal control, along with dozens of monasteries, convents, and lesser ecclesiastical holdings. Protestant princes who have funded armies and built palaces using ecclesiastical revenues face bankruptcy if forced to surrender these foundations of their power. The edict transforms theological disputes into economic warfare that threatens the survival of Protestant political structures throughout the empire. Meanwhile, a shadowy figure emerges from the Moravian borderlands to revolutionize European warfare. Albrecht von Waldstein arrives at Ferdinand's court in Vienna with proposals that seem too ambitious to believe, yet too valuable to ignore. The minor Moravian nobleman claims he can raise, equip, and maintain massive armies using innovative financial methods that require no drain on royal treasuries. His system depends on systematic exploitation of occupied territories, forcing conquered populations to feed, clothe, and pay the very forces that oppress them. The general's military entrepreneurship represents something entirely new in European warfare. Traditional armies march with elaborate supply trains that limit their mobility and drain their treasuries. The Moravians' forces live off the land they traverse, seizing what they need while imposing contributions that fund their continued operations. War becomes self-financing, as occupied territories provide the resources necessary for their own continued occupation. The system turns military campaigning into profitable business enterprise that enriches commanders while bankrupting victims. The entrepreneur's first army numbers 24,000 men, recruited from across Central Europe, German veterans of Czech campaigns, Italian adventurers seeking fortune, Croatian cavalry fleeing Ottoman pressure, Walloon infantry displaced by Dutch wars. National identity matters less than professional competence and willingness to follow orders that promise regular pay extracted from enemy populations. These cosmopolitan forces owe loyalty to their commander personally, rather than to any dynasty, creating a military instrument of unprecedented power and equally unprecedented danger. The northern invasion of Central Europe during the spring of 1625 initially appears to vindicate Protestant hopes that Austrian strength can be broken by determined resistance. The army crosses the Elbe with confidence, born of recent victories over Swedish forces and alliance agreements that promise French subsidies and English support. Experienced officers have campaigned across northern Europe, while disciplined infantry carry weapons purchased with sound toll revenues that have funded military modernization. The invaders advance through Lower Saxony with methodical efficiency, capturing fortified towns while recruiting German Protestant volunteers eager to strike back at papal oppression. Local populations welcome the soldiers as liberators who will restore theological freedom and constitutional tradition violated by Ferdinand's authoritarian policies. Town councils that have watched nervously as Jesuit missionaries arrive with Austrian escorts now celebrate Protestant deliverance from papal tyranny. Yet apparent advantages conceal fundamental weaknesses that will prove fatal as the campaign develops. French subsidies arrive irregularly, if at all, forcing the northern king to finance operations from his own resources, while promising allies fail to provide promised military support. English assistance remains purely diplomatic, consisting of encouraging speeches rather than practical aid. The Protestant German princes, who should naturally support the intervention, instead pursue separate negotiations with Vienna, hoping to preserve their own territories through timely submission. The Moravians' response demonstrates the new military possibilities that financial innovation has created. Rather than defending fixed positions where northern experience might prove decisive, he withdraws into Mecklenburg and Pomerania, drawing enemy forces away from their supply lines while rapidly expanding his own army through recruitment campaigns that promise immediate employment to unemployed soldiers throughout Central Europe. By autumn, the general commands nearly 40,000 men, whose numbers continue growing as success attracts volunteers from across the continent. The confrontation at Dessau Bridge during April of 1626 provides the first test of the innovative military system. Ernst von Mansfeld attempts to force a crossing with 15,000 veteran troops hardened by years of campaigning in the Palatinate and Netherlands. The hastily constructed defences seem inadequate to contain such experienced assault forces, yet the commander has prepared surprises that transform apparent weakness into overwhelming strength. Artillery positioned on the Dessau heights commands every approach to the bridge, while carefully concealed infantry awaits the moment when Mansfeld's forces become committed to their assault. The attack begins promisingly as veteran pikemen advance through the morning mist, but concealed batteries open fire with devastating effect as soon as the attackers reach optimal range. Mansfeld's formations dissolve under concentrated bombardment that demonstrates mastery of contemporary military technology. The defeat at Dessau eliminates one of Protestant Europe's most experienced commanders, while demonstrating that Austrian forces can match any army in Europe for professional competence. Mansfeld dies of disease shortly afterward, removing a military leader whose tactical genius might have compensated for Protestant strategic disadvantages. His death symbolizes the broader Protestant predicament. Individual excellence cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in resources, organization, and political support. The pursuit of retreating northern forces reveals the terrifying efficiency of the military economic system. Towns that resist face systematic devastation, designed to discourage future opposition, while settlements that submit peacefully find themselves subjected to contributions that fund continued operations. The general's forces move across northern Europe like a plague of locusts, consuming everything necessary for their survival while leaving wasteland behind them. The siege of Stralsund during the summer of 1628 demonstrates both the power and limitations of this approach to warfare. The Baltic port city commands crucial supply lines that link Swedish territories to Protestant allies in the empire, making its capture essential for complete Austrian control of northern Europe. Yet Stralsund's position on an island connected to the mainland by easily defended causeways neutralizes many advantages that the mobile forces possess elsewhere. Swedish intervention saves Stralsund from capture, while revealing the international dimensions of what began as German civil conflict. Gustav Adolf's forces arrive just as the siege approaches success, demonstrating that Sweden will not permit Austrian control of Baltic coastlines that threaten Swedish commercial and strategic interests. The confrontation establishes a pattern that will dominate the coming decade, local conflicts escalating into international wars, as major powers pursue their separate agendas through proxy campaigns in the empire. The failed siege marks the high point of the entrepreneur's influence and the beginning of his downfall. Ferdinand begins receiving complaints from German princes about the general's arbitrary methods and excessive demands for contributions that bankrupt territories supposedly loyal to Austrian authority. Papal allies find themselves treated little better than conquered enemies, as the forces extract resources necessary for their continued operations, regardless of local political sympathies. The dismissal in August of 1630 removes the most effective military commander in papal service, while revealing the political constraints that limit even successful generals. The ruler cannot afford to alienate German princes whose cooperation he needs for effective governance. Yet he also cannot control a military entrepreneur whose power threatens to overshadow royal authority itself. The Moravian general retreats to his estates in disgrace, though his innovative military financial methods have permanently transformed European warfare. The northern defeat at Lutter in August of 1626 had already broken hopes of establishing hegemony over northern Europe. Tilly's veteran papal forces demolished enemy formations with professional efficiency that highlighted the difference between armies hardened by years of European campaigning and forces accustomed to fighting only Scandinavian neighbours. The retreat toward Jutland becomes a rout as demoralized soldiers abandon equipment and weapons while fleeing toward home territory. The Peace of Lübeck in May of 1629 formally ends northern intervention while establishing Austrian authority throughout the region. The king retains his territories, but abandons all claims to German lands, effectively recognizing Austrian supremacy in exchange for permission to return to Copenhagen with his crown intact. The treaty represents complete papal victory that eliminates the last significant Protestant military force capable of challenging Austrian authority. Yet this very completeness of triumph creates new problems that will ultimately prove more dangerous than Protestant resistance ever was. French observers note with alarm that Austrian power now extends from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, creating an encirclement that threatens French security more seriously than any previous European development. Cardinal Richelieu begins calculating whether papal solidarity matters more than French national interest when confronted by the prospect of permanent Austrian hegemony over Europe. Economic devastation spreads across the German territories as years of military campaigns exhaust local resources while disrupting traditional patterns of production and trade. The Hanseatic League watches helplessly as its member cities suffer military occupation that destroys commercial networks built over centuries of patient development. Agricultural regions face systematic exploitation that reduces peasant families to starvation, while their surplus feeds armies that consume everything available before moving on to fresh victims. Currency debasement reaches crisis levels as territorial rulers, desperate for revenue, reduce the silver content of their coins while increasing their nominal values. The resulting inflation destroys traditional price relationships that have governed European commerce for generations, creating opportunities for speculators while ruining merchants who depend on stable exchange rates. Local markets collapse as worthless money chases increasingly scarce goods, forcing communities to resort to barter systems that cannot support complex economic relationships. Social upheaval accompanies economic collapse as traditional hierarchies crumble under military pressure. Noble families flee advancing armies, while peasant refugees crowd into fortified cities that cannot feed their normal populations, much less thousands of additional mouths. Craft guilds abandon their workshops as raw materials become unavailable and customers disappear, reducing skilled artisans to beggary alongside the agricultural labourers they once scorned. The witch trials that proliferate throughout war-torn territories reflect social tensions that find expression in supernatural explanations for inexplicable disasters. Communities facing military devastation, economic collapse, and demographic catastrophe search for scapegoats who can explain why God permits such suffering to afflict his people. Accusations multiply as neighbors turn upon each other with suspicions that previous generations would have dismissed as impossible fantasies. Theological revival movements spring up across the ravaged territories as populations seek spiritual comfort for earthly afflictions that seem beyond human remedy. Mystical preachers attract followers with promises of divine intervention that will restore peace and prosperity to lands that have forgotten what either means. These spiritual movements often develop political dimensions, as desperate people embrace any leader who promises deliverance from their current miseries. Ferdinand's triumph in Northern Europe establishes Austrian supremacy, but fails to create the stable papal hegemony that was its ultimate objective. The Edict of Restitution proves impossible to enforce completely, while creating bitter resentment among Protestant populations who cannot resist, but will not forget the humiliations imposed upon them. Swedish military preparations suggest that the northern defeat marks not the end of Protestant resistance, but merely the pause before a more dangerous challenger enters the conflict. The northern phase concludes with papal power at its zenith, yet simultaneously more vulnerable than ever before. Military success has created political problems that threaten to prove more difficult than the military challenges they replaced. The very completeness of Austrian victory ensures that future resistance will assume international dimensions, as foreign powers recognize that their own survival depends on preventing permanent Austrian domination of Central Europe. As snow begins falling across the German territories at the end of 1629, refugees huddle around inadequate fires, while armies prepare for campaigns that will make previous devastation seem mild by comparison. The northern intervention has ended, but the forces it unleashed continue gathering strength in Stockholm, Paris, and other capitals, where ambitious rulers calculate whether the time has come to challenge Austrian power before it becomes truly unassailable. Mist rises from the Baltic waters as 36 ships of the line anchor off Peenemünde on the Pomeranian coast. Their holds crammed with 13,000 battle-hardened soldiers who have spent years perfecting the art of war in the frozen forests of Livonia and Russia. At their head stands a giant of a man whose presence transforms every room he enters. Gustav II Adolf of Sweden, the Lion of the North, whose innovative genius and personal magnetism have already made him the most feared commander in Northern Europe. His pale blue eyes survey the coastline with the calculating gaze of a chess master, contemplating moves that will reshape the continental balance. The Nordic monarch's intervention springs from a complex web of strategic necessities that extend far beyond theological solidarity with embattled reformers. For decades, Sweden has fought to dominate the Baltic trade routes that pour wealth into Stockholm's royal treasury, battling Polish-Lithuanian troops in Livonia, while containing Russian expansion into territories that Nordic merchants consider their exclusive domain. Now, Austrian victory in northern territories threatens to strangle Nordic commerce by placing hostile powers in control of crucial ports from which Baltic trade flows to markets throughout central regions. The landing at Peenemünde during June of 1630 marks a calculated gamble that could either establish Nordic hegemony over northern regions or destroy the Vasa dynasty's carefully constructed Baltic Empire. The king brings more than soldiers and cannons to soil. He carries revolutionary innovations that will transform European warfare, while pursuing diplomatic objectives that extend Nordic influence deep into the heart of the continent. His troops represent the culmination of decades of reform that has created the most professional fighting force the continent has seen since the Roman legions. Nordic superiority rests on innovations that other European armies have struggled unsuccessfully to implement. Where traditional troops deploy in massive, unwieldy formations that lumber across battlefields like heavily armed mobs, Nordic regiments operate with precision that reflects years of drilling and discipline. Gustav Adolf has reduced his infantry units to 6-man ranks that can maneuver quickly while maintaining firepower, supported by lightweight artillery that moves with the troops rather than anchoring them to fixed positions. Most importantly, Nordic soldiers understand their roles within larger schemes that coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery into unified striking instruments. The revolutionary approach extends beyond mere technical improvements to encompass entire concepts of organization. Nordic officers earn promotion through demonstrated competence rather than aristocratic birth, creating a professional hierarchy that prizes innovation over social precedent. Standardized equipment ensures that every Nordic musket fires the same caliber ammunition, while every pike measures exactly the same length, eliminating the chaotic variety that hampers coordination in other armies. Regular pay prevents the desertion and indiscipline that plague troops dependent on irregular contributions extracted from unwilling populations. French gold finances Nordic operations through a sophisticated alliance system that places Cardinal Richelieu's diplomatic genius at the service of reformed strength. The Cardinal calculates that Nordic success will weaken Austrian dominance without strengthening any single authority sufficiently to threaten French interests. His subsidies flow to Stockholm through carefully concealed channels that maintain official French neutrality while providing the king with the resources necessary for sustained campaigning. The arrangement transforms theological conflict into balance of power politics, where confessional solidarity yields to national advantage. The monarch's initial movements reveal strategic patience that contrasts sharply with the desperate haste that characterized previous reformed interventions. Rather than rushing toward decisive engagements that might end in catastrophic defeat, the Nordic expedition systematically secures its base of operations in Pomerania, while building alliances with princes who have survived the disasters that befell earlier resistance movements. Gustav Adolf understands that lasting success requires political foundations as solid as achievements on the field. The siege of Magdeburg provides the first test of Nordic resolve against entrenched Austrian authority. The city has endured occupation since its fall during the reformed collapse of the previous decade, its population systematically oppressed by administrators who view reformed resistance as both heretical rebellion and treasonous defiance of legitimate authority. Relief efforts must overcome not merely obstacles, but also the demoralization that years of defeat have instilled in reformed communities throughout the empire. Yet before Nordic troops can reach the beleaguered city, Austrian armies under Johann Cercles von Tilly storm its walls in May of 1631. What follows represents one of the war's most horrific atrocities, as undisciplined soldiers, maddened by months of siege warfare and inflamed by theological hatred, systematically massacre Magdeburg's civilian population. 20,000 inhabitants perish in flames that consume most of the city, while survivors flee, carrying tales of horror that spread across reformed territories like shockwaves from an earthquake. The Magdeburg massacre electrifies reformed opinion throughout the continent, while providing the king with propaganda advantages that no victory could achieve. Every reformed pulpit thunders with denunciations of papal barbarism that supposedly reveals the true nature of papal tyranny when unconstrained by civilized convention. The atrocity transforms the Nordic intervention from a foreign invasion into a crusade for reformed survival, enabling Gustav Adolf to recruit allies who might otherwise hesitate to support foreign intervention in affairs of the empire. John George of Saxony finally abandons his futile neutrality to join the Nordic alliance, bringing with him the resources of the empire's most powerful reformed state. The Saxon elector has spent years trying to preserve his territories through accommodation with Austrian authority, but the Magdeburg massacre convinces him that compromise with papal militancy leads inevitably to reformed extinction. His decision tilts the balance decisively towards Sweden, while providing the monarch with local knowledge and political legitimacy that pure foreign strength could never achieve. The confrontation at Breitenfeld on September 17, 1631, becomes the first major test of Nordic innovations against the veteran troops that have dominated European battlefields for 2 decades. Tilly deploys his forces in traditional formations that have proven successful from the Netherlands to Hungary. Massive blocks of pikemen supported by cavalry wings that can exploit any gaps in enemy lines. His soldiers have fought in dozens of campaigns, while their officers learned their trade in the brutal school of continuous warfare that has raged across the continent since the Czech Revolt. The Lion of the North arrays his troops according to revolutionary principles that European observers struggle to comprehend. Nordic infantry deploys in shallow lines that maximize firepower, while maintaining mobility supported by artillery pieces light enough to reposition during combat, rather than remaining fixed throughout the engagement. Cavalry units receive orders to charge home with sabres, rather than relying on pistol volleys that have become standard practice among other European armies. Most importantly, the entire Nordic expedition operates according to predetermined schemes that coordinate different arms into unified striking instruments. The engagement unfolds with shocking suddenness as Nordic artillery opens fire at ranges where Austrian cannons cannot respond effectively. Tilly's formations begin taking casualties before they can close to effective musket range, disrupting the careful timing that traditional methods require. When Austrian cavalry finally charges the Nordic lines, they discover that mobile artillery can shift position to support threatened sectors, while disciplined infantry maintains formation under pressure that would shatter less professional troops. Saxon troops initially flee in panic when Austrian cavalry breaks through their position, threatening to expose the Nordic flank to envelopment that could destroy Gustav Adolf's entire expedition. Yet the king demonstrates flexibility that transforms potential disaster into decisive victory by rapidly redeploying his reserves to counter the Austrian breakthrough while launching his own cavalry charge against Tilly's weakened centre. The engagement becomes a masterclass in battlefield command as the monarch coordinates multiple movements while personally leading charges that inspire his soldiers to superhuman efforts. The Austrian collapse at Breitenfeld sends shockwaves throughout the continent as veteran papal armies that have dominated continental warfare for 2 decades disintegrate before Nordic superiority. Tilly himself suffers wounds that will eventually prove mortal, while his scattered troops flee southward, carrying news of defeat that shakes Austrian confidence to its foundations. For the first time since the Czech Revolt, reformed arms have achieved decisive victory against the full strength of papal strength. The king's pursuit transforms success into strategic revolution, as Nordic troops pour into central territories, liberating reformed communities while recruiting allies who had despaired of effective resistance to Austrian dominance. Gustav Adolf's advance toward the Rhine brings Nordic strength to the borders of France while threatening Spanish supply lines that connect Habsburg territories in Italy to the fighting fronts in the Netherlands. European diplomats recalculate balance of power equations that Nordic victory has completely overturned. The liberation of reformed territories reveals both the possibilities and limitations of Nordic authority in central regions. Populations that have endured years of papal oppression welcome the monarch as a divinely appointed deliverer who has vindicated reformed faith through success. Yet the same theological enthusiasm that facilitates Nordic recruitment also creates expectations for transformation that exceed what any foreign intervention can realistically achieve. Reformed populations want Nordic protection, but not Nordic domination, creating tensions that will complicate future operations. Winter quarters in Mainz provide Gustav Adolf with time to consolidate political gains while planning operations that will either establish permanent Nordic influence in central territories or provoke the papal response that could destroy everything Nordic arms have achieved. The king receives delegations from reformed princes throughout the empire, while negotiating with Richelieu's agents who pursue French objectives that sometimes conflict with Nordic interests. The diplomatic challenge proves as complex as any problem the Nordic expedition has confronted. The recall of the Moravian general to Austrian service signals recognition that conventional methods cannot contain Nordic innovations without matching Nordic sophistication. The entrepreneur's return from disgrace brings with him entrepreneurial methods that can rapidly expand Austrian troops, while introducing organizational reforms that promise to neutralize Nordic advantages. Yet the general's personal ambitions and independent base create dangers for Ferdinand that may prove greater than the Nordic threat itself. The monarch's campaigns during 1632 carry Nordic arms deeper into the empire than any foreign invader since the barbarian migrations that destroyed the Roman Empire. His troops capture Augsburg, München, and Nuremberg, while threatening Vienna itself with encirclement that could force Ferdinand to abandon his hereditary domains. Yet each Nordic advance stretches supply lines that become increasingly vulnerable to Austrian counterattack, while committing resources to territorial occupation that reduces the mobile striking strength on which Nordic superiority depends. The meeting engagement at Lutzen on November 16, 1632, becomes the king's final confrontation, as mist and smoke obscure a field where reformed and papal troops clash with desperate fury. Gustav Adolf leads cavalry charges with characteristic personal courage, while directing maneuvers that gradually overcome Austrian resistance through superior firepower and battlefield mobility. Yet in the moment of victory, a stray musket ball ends the life of the continent's greatest genius, transforming Nordic triumph into reformed catastrophe. The monarch's death creates a vacuum that neither his infant daughter nor the Regency Council can effectively fill. Axel Oxenstierna assumes control of Nordic policy with diplomatic skill that rivals his deceased king's genius. But no civilian administrator can inspire the personal loyalty that enabled Gustav Adolf to transform Nordic armies into instruments of his individual will. The reformed cause loses not merely a brilliant commander, but the charismatic leadership that had convinced allies to accept Nordic hegemony as the price of papal defeat. The Regency government faces impossible choices as it attempts to preserve Nordic gains while lacking the genius that created them. Withdrawing from central territories would abandon reformed allies to papal vengeance, while sacrificing territorial acquisitions that Nordic blood has purchased. Yet continued campaigning requires resources that Stockholm's treasury cannot provide indefinitely, while confronting enemies who have learned to counter Nordic innovations through imitation and adaptation. The Moravian's growing independence transforms him from Austrian servant into potential revolutionary who might overturn the entire European political system. His private negotiations with French agents, reformed princes, and even Nordic representatives suggest plans for a settlement that would eliminate both Austrian and Nordic dominance, while establishing a new balance based on his personal authority. Yet these very negotiations convince Ferdinand that his general has become more dangerous than the enemies he was recalled to defeat. The assassination of the entrepreneur at Eger in February of 1634 removes the most innovative mind of his generation, while eliminating the one commander who might have matched Gustav Adolf's genius. Ferdinand's agents murder the general before his treasonous negotiations can mature into open rebellion. Yet they also destroy the instrument that offered the best hope for decisive papal victory. The removal of both the Lion of the North and the Moravian within 2 years leaves European battlefields to lesser commanders whose competence cannot match the revolutionary innovations that these geniuses introduced. Nordic strength begins its gradual decline as the Regency government struggles with challenges that exceed its capabilities. Allies who accepted Nordic leadership when the monarch's personal magnetism made submission palatable now chafe under administrators whose authority rests on bureaucratic efficiency rather than genius. French subsidies continue flowing to Stockholm, but Richelieu's agents increasingly treat Nordic troops as French auxiliaries rather than independent allies pursuing their own objectives. The confrontation at Nördlingen in September of 1634 demonstrates how quickly Nordic supremacy can evaporate when brilliant individual leadership yields to conventional administration. Austrian troops, strengthened by Spanish reinforcements and commanded by officers who have studied Nordic methods, inflict crushing defeat on reformed armies that lack the inspirational leadership and innovation that Gustav Adolf provided. The disaster forces Nordic evacuation of southern territories, while convincing allies that reformed superiority was personal to the king rather than inherent in the reformed cause. As 1635 dawns across war-ravaged central territories, the Nordic phase approaches its end, with reformed strength diminished but not destroyed, papal authority restored but not triumphant. The Lion of the North's revolutionary legacy lives on in manuals that spread Nordic innovations throughout European armies. Yet no commander emerges who can combine genius with strategic vision and personal charisma that Gustav Adolf embodied. The war enters a new phase where balance of power calculations will matter more than theological conviction, where French diplomacy will prove more decisive than Nordic arms, and where the dreams of reformed hegemony that the king briefly made possible dissolve into the more modest goal of reformed survival. The stage is set for French entry into the conflict, as Cardinal Richelieu calculates that direct intervention can achieve French objectives more effectively than subsidizing reformed proxies whose strength has proven insufficient to contain Austrian resurgence. The theological war that began with Czech rebellion will become a European balance of power struggle, where national interests triumph over confessional solidarity, where dynastic ambition supersedes theological loyalty, and where the medieval dream of universal Christian empire finally yields to the modern reality of competing sovereign states pursuing their separate destinies through diplomacy, commerce, and carefully limited warfare. Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu stands before a map of Europe in his chambers at the Palais Cardinal, his pale fingers tracing the borders that separate France from the vast Habsburg domains, stretching from Spain through Austria to the Netherlands. The cardinal's calculating eyes survey territorial arrangements that have encircled the realm with enemies since Charles V's reign, a nightmare that successive ministers have struggled unsuccessfully to resolve through diplomacy alone. Now, with Nordic strength waning and reformed resistance collapsing throughout Central Europe, the moment has arrived for direct intervention that will either shatter Habsburg hegemony or destroy the Bourbon dynasty in the attempt. The decision to abandon centuries of practice requires justification that transcends mere territorial ambition. The cardinal articulates the principle of raison d'etat, reason of state, that places national survival above traditional loyalties, transforming what appears to be betrayal of the faith into the highest form of patriotic duty. France may share theological bonds with Habsburg Austria, yet those same bonds cannot prevent Austrian domination from strangling Gallic commerce, threatening borders and reducing the most Christian king to a Habsburg vassal. When survival demands choosing between confession and country, the minister calculates that God surely favors the nation that serves his purposes most effectively. The formal declaration of conflict against Madrid in May of 1635 represents more than diplomatic maneuvering. It announces the realm's emergence as the dominant European state, willing to challenge Habsburg supremacy regardless of theological complications. Louis XIII signs the declaration with visible reluctance, understanding that his minister's approach will transform France from a regional authority into a continental hegemon, while requiring sacrifices that may exceed capacity to sustain. Yet the alternative, permanent encirclement by hostile Habsburg territories, offers no hope for long-term independence. Bourbon's strategy reflects the cardinal's sophisticated understanding of European balance of power dynamics that previous ministers have grasped only imperfectly. Rather than seeking territorial conquest that would alarm potential allies, Paris aims to weaken Habsburg authority sufficiently to ensure security, while preserving enough Austrian strength to contain Ottoman expansion in southeastern Europe. The delicate calculation requires simultaneous cooperation with reformed princes, ongoing subsidies to Nordic forces, and direct confrontation with Iberian armies that have dominated European battlefields since the reign of Philip II. The Spanish road becomes the primary target as the minister recognizes that cutting Habsburg supply lines between Italy and the Netherlands will cripple Iberian operations throughout northern Europe. This ancient route carries not merely soldiers and supplies, but the silver that finances Iberian armies, the diplomatic communications that coordinate Habsburg diplomacy, and the commercial goods that sustain Madrid's hegemony over European trade networks. Severing these connections will force Madrid to choose between defending the Netherlands and maintaining Italian possessions, a dilemma that pressure can exploit. The siege of Corby during the summer of 1636 provides Iberian forces with their last significant triumph against Gallic armies, demonstrating that Habsburg traditions retain enough vitality to threaten ambitions when properly led and adequately supplied. Cardinal Infante Ferdinand's capture of the fortress creates panic in Paris as Iberian cavalry patrols approach within sight of the capital's walls. Yet the very audacity of Madrid's success reveals the weakness that the Cardinal's approach has created. Spain can win dramatic victories, but lacks the resources to sustain conquests when resistance continues. Recovery from the Corby disaster illustrates the advantages that superior resources provide when combined with competent leadership and patience. Where Iberian commanders must achieve decisive results with limited means, Gallic generals can afford temporary setbacks while building the overwhelming strength that eventually guarantees success. The recapture of Corby, within months of its loss, demonstrates resilience while proving that Iberian triumphs, however spectacular, cannot alter the fundamental balance that favors France in any prolonged conflict. The Dutch alliance transforms the approach from continental containment to global confrontation, as Amsterdam's naval capabilities complement territorial strength in a combination that threatens Iberian hegemony throughout Europe and beyond. Dutch commerce provides France with access to markets and resources so that Madrid's control of American silver cannot match, while pressure relieves Dutch territories of Iberian attacks that have drained Amsterdam's treasury for decades. The partnership creates synergies that multiply each ally's individual capabilities while exposing Iberian weaknesses that neither France nor the Netherlands could exploit independently. Operations emphasize systematic fortress reduction, as the Cardinal's engineers apply scientific methods that minimize casualties while maximizing territorial gains. The minister understands that demographic and economic advantages make prolonged conflict favorable, provided commanders avoid the catastrophic defeats that could destroy armies faster than resources can replace them. Methodical siege operations achieve steady progress while preserving the professional forces that represent the realm's most valuable asset. The evolution of fortification science reflects broader changes in European combat, as engineers develop increasingly sophisticated defensive systems that can resist artillery bombardment while channeling attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Star-shaped bastions replace medieval walls throughout European frontier regions, creating defensive networks that transform combat from mobile campaigns into elaborate engineering contests. Mastery of these techniques provides significant advantages over Iberian commanders, who continue relying on traditional methods that mobile artillery can overcome. Artillery innovation accompanies fortification development, as foundries produce cannons that combine increased range with improved mobility, enabling field armies to conduct siege operations without the massive supply trains that previous generations required. Standardized calibers reduce logistical complexity, while improved metallurgy creates weapons that can fire more rapidly without mechanical failure. These technical advances reflect the broader commitment to modernization that Iberian conservatism cannot match. Economic combat proves as decisive as field operations, as the realm's approach systematically undermines the commercial foundations of Iberian authority throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Privateers, attack Iberian treasure fleets, while merchants establish trading relationships that bypass Madrid's commercial networks. The disruption of revenue streams forces Madrid to choose between funding operations and maintaining domestic stability, a dilemma that the Cardinals' approach deliberately creates. The Catalonian Revolt of 1640 demonstrates how internal pressures can amplify external pressure to create existential threats that no amount of competence can overcome. When agents encourage Catalonian separatism while armies threaten Iberian frontiers, Madrid faces the classic nightmare of fighting enemies on multiple fronts without adequate resources for either theatre. The revolt's success proves that Iberian hegemony rests on foundations too narrow to support the global empire that ambitions require. Portuguese independence in December of 1640 eliminates Madrid's control over Portuguese territories in Brazil, Africa, and Asia that have provided crucial revenues for Iberian operations throughout Europe. The loss forces Spain to concentrate remaining resources on European frontiers, while abandoning global ambitions that had been pursued since the reign of Philip II. Diplomacy orchestrates the timing of Portuguese rebellion to coincide with maximum Iberian vulnerability, demonstrating the Cardinals' mastery of coordination that successful alliance systems require. The siege of La Rochelle's aftermath continues influencing domestic administration as the minister consolidates royal authority while eliminating potential sources of internal opposition to foreign conflict. The systematic destruction of Huguenot political autonomy removes the possibility that Madrid might exploit religious divisions to create domestic rebellion similar to the Catalonian uprising. Unity becomes an asset that multiplies capabilities while denying enemies the internal allies that Iberian diplomacy has traditionally cultivated. Administrative reform transforms organization from feudal improvisation to bureaucratic professionalism, as the Cardinals' ministers create systems for recruitment, supply, and command that can sustain prolonged conflict without the constant improvisation that characterizes other European armies. Regular pay prevents the desertion and indiscipline that plague forces dependent on irregular contributions, while standardized equipment ensures logistical efficiency that mobile operations require. These reforms create advantages that transcend individual battles to influence entire campaigns. The role of women expands significantly, as prolonged conflict requires mobilization of domestic resources that traditional gender roles have not utilized. Noble ladies manage estates while their husbands campaign. Merchant wives maintain commercial operations during their spouse's service, and peasant women assume agricultural responsibilities that combat has transferred from male to female hands. These social adaptations enable France to sustain efforts that would otherwise exceed available manpower. Mercenary recruitment reflects the international dimensions of the approach as agents hire soldiers throughout Europe, creating cosmopolitan armies that serve interests regardless of their members' national origins. Veterans of Nordic campaigns, Italian adventurers seeking employment, and Croatian cavalry fleeing Ottoman pressure all find service in ranks, bringing experience that supplements tactical knowledge while diluting potential national loyalties that enemies might exploit. Religious controversy complicates alliance relationships as Protestant allies question commitment to Reformed interests, while papal supporters condemn cooperation with heretical authorities. The Cardinals' diplomatic genius lies in convincing each ally that the realm's approach ultimately serves their interests, despite apparent contradictions that seem to violate natural alliance patterns. Success demonstrates that national interest can transcend religious loyalty when skillfully managed and consistently applied. The Battle of Rocroi in May of 1643 symbolizes the transformation of European balance, as infantry defeats Iberian tercio formations that have dominated European battlefields since the reign of Philip II. The young Duke of Enghien's triumph demonstrates that reforms have created tactical capabilities superior to traditional Madrid methods, while Iberian defeat reveals the exhaustion that decades of global conflict have imposed on resources. The engagement marks not merely Gallic success, but Iberian decline from European hegemony to regional authority. Cardinal Mazarin's succession to the cardinal's position in December of 1642 ensures continuity, despite the administrative transition that might otherwise disrupt diplomatic relationships carefully constructed over years of patient negotiation. The Italian-born minister brings different talents to service, greater flexibility in tactical adjustments, superior understanding of papal politics, and enhanced appreciation for commercial considerations, while maintaining objectives that the previous cardinal's legacy has established as fundamental interests. The death of Louis XIII in May of 1643 creates potential instability as regency government replaces royal authority with the uncertainties that minority rule inevitably generates. Yet the new cardinal's partnership with Anne of Austria ensures continuity, while the momentum that the previous minister's approach has created sustains operations despite domestic political transitions. The institutional strength that administrative reforms have developed proves capable of surviving individual changes that might otherwise derail long-term planning. Innovation in finance enables sustained operations that Iberian resource constraints cannot match, as the new minister's administration develops credit mechanisms that mobilize economic strength more effectively than previous methods achieved. Government bonds provide reliable revenue streams, while commercial partnerships generate tax income that success protects and expands. These fiscal innovations create self-reinforcing cycles, where triumph produces economic benefits that fund additional operations. The emergence of guerrilla combat throughout Iberian territories reflects the breakdown of traditional discipline, as irregular forces adopt tactics that conventional armies cannot effectively counter. Agents encourage local resistance movements while providing weapons and supplies that transform scattered brigandage into coordinated resistance. These developments demonstrate how prolonged conflict can undermine social order while creating opportunities that skilled diplomacy can exploit. Iberian diplomatic isolation reaches completion as former allies abandon Madrid in favor of accommodation with authority that offers better prospects for territorial and commercial advantage. The papacy maintains official neutrality while secretly favoring success that promises to weaken Austrian dominance over Italian politics. Princes accept subsidies while providing armies with bases and supplies that Iberian diplomacy cannot prevent or counteract. As 1643 draws toward its close, the realm's approach has achieved most of its objectives through patient application of superior resources, guided by sophisticated understanding of European balance of power dynamics. Habsburg encirclement of France has yielded to containment of Habsburg territories. Iberian hegemony has crumbled under pressures that the approach has systematically applied. An emergence as Europe's dominant authority appears inevitable, despite continued resistance from enemies who lack the resources necessary for effective opposition. The phase concludes with continental relationships fundamentally transformed from patterns that have dominated European politics since the reign of Charles V. National interest has triumphed over religious solidarity. Administrative efficiency has overcome feudal improvisation, and patience has defeated tactical brilliance unsupported by adequate resources. The stage is set for the final phase of the conflict as exhausted combatants begin recognizing that diplomatic settlement offers better prospects than continued combat for achieving objectives that force alone cannot secure. The candles burn low in Cardinal Mazarin's study as reports arrive from across a continent that has forgotten what tranquility means. 25 years of continuous conflict have transformed the region into a wasteland where entire districts lie depopulated, where cities that once bustled with commerce stand empty behind broken walls, where fields that should wave with grain grow nothing but weeds and the bones of the unburied dead. The Italian-born minister reads dispatches that catalogue destruction beyond human comprehension. Villages wiped from existence, noble families extinct, trade routes abandoned to brigands who show mercy to no one. Ferdinand III inherits a crown that weighs heavier with each passing month, as the Austrian dominions crumble under pressures that no single ruler can contain. The young Habsburg faces challenges that would have tested his grandfather's legendary determination. Gallic armies threatening Vienna itself, Nordic forces controlling much of northern regions, Dutch fleets interdicting Iberian commerce throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The empire that once stretched from Madrid to Budapest now resembles a collection of isolated fortresses connected by roads too dangerous for civilian travel. The death of Louis XIII in May of 1643 removes one of the few remaining links to the continent that existed before this catastrophic conflict began. Yet his passing barely disrupts the momentum of destruction that has acquired its own terrible logic. Anne of Austria assumes the regency with dignity that cannot disguise her inexperience in managing the complex alliance systems that Gallic statecraft has constructed over years of patient work. The 5-year-old Louis XIV represents hope for eventual stability, but decades must pass before the Sun King can assume personal rule over a kingdom that may not survive its current trials. Cardinal Richelieu's death the previous December eliminates the strategic genius whose vision transformed France from a regional authority into the dominant continental force, leaving behind institutional structures that function efficiently despite the absence of their creator's guiding intelligence. Mazarin brings different talents to administration, greater flexibility in tactical adjustments, superior understanding of papal politics, enhanced appreciation for commercial considerations. Yet he lacks his predecessor's ability to inspire fear and respect among allies and enemies alike. The demographic catastrophe that engulfs central regions defies measurement by any statistical methods available to 17th century observers. Entire districts of Württemberg report population losses exceeding 70% as famine, disease, and direct violence combine to create depopulation, rivaling the Black Death's medieval destruction. The Palatinate, once among the most prosperous areas, supports barely 1/10 of its pre-war inhabitants, while Bohemia's countryside lies so thoroughly ruined that wolves hunt in packs through villages where children once played. Urban populations suffer equally horrific losses as siege combat, economic collapse, and epidemic disease transform thriving commercial centers into necropoli where the living envy the dead. Augsburg's population falls from 70,000 to 18,000 as repeated occupations by competing armies destroy the manufacturing base that sustained the city's prosperity. Prague loses half its inhabitants while Munich's streets echo with emptiness, where merchants once conducted business that connected Bavaria to markets throughout the continent. The breakdown of monetary systems accelerates economic collapse as desperate rulers debase their currencies to fund operations that consume resources faster than any economy can produce them. Silver content in coins falls to 20% of pre-war standards, while princes issue paper currency that no merchant will accept at face value. Barter systems replace monetary exchange throughout rural areas, where peasants refuse payment in coins, whose value changes weekly according to fortunes they cannot influence or predict. Agricultural ruin creates famine conditions that persist year after year as systematic foraging combines with climate deterioration to produce crop failures that no amount of individual effort can overcome. The Little Ice Age, that began during the late 16th century, reaches its most severe phase precisely when conflict prevents the storage and distribution systems that might ameliorate its effects. Cannibalism appears in regions where such desperation was unthinkable within living memory. The witch trials that proliferate throughout war-torn lands reflect social breakdown that finds expression in supernatural explanations for inexplicable suffering. Communities that have watched neighbors butchered by soldiers, children starved by famine, and livestock stolen by foraging parties seek scapegoats who can explain why divine providence permits such afflictions. Accusations multiply as desperate people turn upon each other with suspicions that previous generations would have dismissed as impossible madness. Mercenary armies evolve into self-perpetuating organizations that exist independently of the political objectives they were originally recruited to serve, creating formations whose primary loyalty extends to their own survival rather than any state or cause. These forces roam across central regions like mobile cities, complete with camp followers, merchants, artisans, and families who have known no other life than perpetual combat. They bargain with local authorities for supplies and quarters, while threatening destruction if their demands are refused. The emergence of brigandage as an organized social phenomenon reflects the complete breakdown of law enforcement throughout areas where competing armies have destroyed traditional authority structures. Former soldiers, displaced peasants, and unemployed artisans band together in groups that control trade routes, levy tolls on travelers, and establish their own domains where recognized governments cannot penetrate. These brigand communities develop elaborate hierarchies and regulations that mimic legitimate political structures. Religious revival movements spring up throughout the ruined regions as populations seek spiritual comfort for earthly afflictions that seem beyond human remedy. Mystical preachers attract followers with promises of divine intervention that will restore order and prosperity to lands that have forgotten what either means. These spiritual movements often develop political dimensions, as desperate people embrace any leader who promises deliverance from their current miseries, while offering explanations for suffering that transcend human understanding. The role of women undergoes revolutionary transformation, as traditional gender roles collapse under pressures that require female assumption of responsibilities previously reserved for men. Noble ladies command garrisons when their husbands die in battle. Merchant women maintain international trade relationships during their spouse's service. And peasant widows organize village defenses against roving soldiers who recognize no distinction between combatants and civilians. These adaptations create precedents that will influence continental social development long after tranquility returns. Children who have known only conflict develop psychological adaptations that alarm adult observers who remember pre-war normality. Young people display callousness toward violence that shocks their elders while demonstrating survival skills that previous education never provided. Entire generations grow to maturity without experiencing the social institutions that previously defined civilization, creating uncertainty about whether traditional cultural patterns can ever be restored. Settlement initiatives multiply as exhausted combatants recognize that armed solutions have become impossible for any participant to achieve independently. The Congress of Westphalia begins meeting during 1644 in the twin cities of Münster and Osnabrück. bringing together representatives from every major continental authority except England and Russia, in talks that must somehow reconcile incompatible objectives while addressing grievances that have accumulated over decades of mutual injury. The complexity of Westphalian talks reflects the transformation of politics from relatively simple dynastic disputes into multidimensional conflicts involving religious, commercial, constitutional issues that resist traditional solutions. Gallic representatives pursue hegemonic objectives that would establish permanent dominance over Habsburg domains, while Austrian envoys seek arrangements that preserve enough authority to prevent complete political collapse. Nordic delegates demand compensation for their contributions, while reformed princes insist on constitutional reforms that would prevent future oppression. Papal representatives face the impossible task of defending interests while acknowledging that religious unity has become unachievable throughout much of the continent. The Vatican's position weakens steadily as powers pursue separate talks with reformed states, demonstrating that confessional solidarity cannot survive contact with national interest when survival is at stake. Pope Innocent X's eventual condemnation of the Westphalian settlement reveals the papacy's isolation from political realities that secular envoys understand, but ecclesiastical authorities cannot accept. The question of reparations creates seemingly insurmountable obstacles, as every participant claims compensation for damages that exceed the total wealth available in the region. Gallic demands for cessions would eliminate Habsburg authority entirely, while Nordic claims for subsidies would bankrupt any government that attempted to satisfy them. The mathematical impossibility of meeting all legitimate demands forces representatives to develop new concepts of compromise that prioritize achievable settlements over abstract justice. Constitutional issues prove equally contentious, as the talks must somehow reconcile unity with princely autonomy, religious diversity with political authority, and traditional privileges with contemporary realities. The Holy Roman Empire's medieval structure cannot accommodate the changes that conflict has created, yet complete dissolution would create power vacuums that neighboring states might exploit to destabilize the entire continental balance. Compromise solutions must preserve enough authority to maintain order, while granting enough princely independence to prevent future rebellion. The Nordic phase reaches its final conclusion as Oxenstierna's regency government recognizes that continued operations cannot achieve the objectives that Gustav Adolf's genius briefly made possible. Nordic forces retain enough strength to demand significant concessions, while lacking sufficient power to impose a solution on central politics. The transformation from hegemonic ambition to compensation reflects broader recognition that total triumph has become impossible for any single participant. Economic considerations increasingly dominate calculations, as representatives recognize that successful settlements must address the commercial disruptions that have contributed as much to suffering as direct action. Trade route restoration requires international cooperation that pure politics cannot achieve, while currency stabilization demands agreements that transcend traditional sovereignty concepts. The integration of economic factors into talks prefigures the commercial statecraft that will characterize later relations. Local initiatives multiply throughout areas where central authorities have lost effective control, creating precedents for settlements that bypass traditional channels. Villages bargain directly with commanders for protection arrangements that ignore larger political objectives, while regional assemblies establish temporary truces that allow agricultural work to proceed despite continuing hostilities elsewhere. These local accommodations demonstrate populations' desperate desire for stability, regardless of its political framework. The gradual emergence of war weariness among leaders reflects recognition that professional armies cannot indefinitely sustain operations. in regions that no longer possess the resources necessary to support them. Even successful commanders discover that victories achieved in ruined areas produce no strategic benefits while consuming forces that cannot be replaced. The logic of professionalism begins favoring settlements over continued campaigns that serve no rational purpose. Intelligence networks that have operated throughout the conflict begin facilitating talks as agents who spent years gathering information transform their activities into communication channels. These informal contacts often prove more effective than official exchanges because they operate outside the formal constraints that limit official initiatives. Secret correspondence between enemy commanders creates personal relationships that transcend official hostilities while providing realistic assessments of capabilities that official reports often distort. The approaching end of the conflict becomes visible in the changing nature of operations, as armies increasingly focus on defensive positions rather than offensive campaigns that might disrupt ongoing talks. Siege combat gives way to positional confrontations, where neither side seeks decisive engagement that could alter the balance. Commanders begin calculating whether gains justify the casualties required to achieve them, when talks might produce equivalent results through other means. As winter settles over the continent in 1647, the Westphalian discussions approach their climax, while exhausted populations await deliverance from sufferings that have exceeded human endurance. The delegates gathered in Münster and Osnabrück face the monumental task of creating a new order from the ruins of the old, establishing principles that can prevent future conflicts while acknowledging the changes that this catastrophic conflict has created. Their success or failure will determine whether the region emerges from this dark age into a new era of stability or collapses into even worse chaos that could destroy civilization entirely. October sunshine streams through the windows of Münster's town hall as exhausted delegates put their signatures to documents that will reshape the landscape of an entire continent. The treaties of Münster and Osnabrück, collectively known as the Accord of Westphalia, represent more than the end of 30 years of unprecedented destruction. They mark the birth of the modern international system that will govern relations between autonomous states for centuries to come. Each signature on the parchment represents a choice to embrace negotiated compromise over continued bloodshed, accommodation over dominance, pragmatic realism over ideological purity. The formal ceremony concludes 4 years of the most complex international conference in human history, involving representatives from virtually every continental authority in discussions that have addressed theological, constitutional, and commercial issues affecting millions of subjects across dozens of entities. The papal nuncio, Fabio Chigi, watches with barely concealed dismay as Catholic and Protestant delegates exchange documents that formally recognize confessional divisions the Church has spent centuries trying to heal. His presence validates the agreement, even as his disapproval signals the Vatican's unwillingness to accept the new realities that necessity has created. Ferdinand III signs the documents with visible relief, understanding that his signature purchases Austrian survival at the cost of Habsburg hegemonic ambitions that his family has pursued since the reign of Charles V. The young ruler retains his hereditary domains and imperial dignity while surrendering the dream of universal monarchy that previous generations considered their destiny. His acceptance demonstrates pragmatic wisdom that chooses preservation over perfection, recognizing that half a loaf surpasses no bread when the alternative means continued warfare that could destroy everything. The confessional provisions extend the Augsburg principle of cuius regio, eius religio, to include Calvinist areas previously excluded from legal recognition, creating a three-way division of German Christianity that acknowledges theological diversity as a permanent feature of continental civilization. Reformed princes received the same rights as Lutheran rulers, while Catholic authorities retain control over regions where their faith predominates. The agreement establishes 1624 as the normal year for determining ownership of disputed lands, freezing the confessional map in configurations that prevent future alterations through military conquest. French gains reflect the careful calculation that has characterized Cardinal Mazarin's approach to the conflict since inheriting Richelieu's strategic vision. Alsace becomes French, while the cities of Metz, Toul, and Verdun receive formal confirmation of French rule that had existed in practice for decades. These acquisitions provide France with defensible frontiers, while eliminating the Spanish road that connected Habsburg domains in Italy with the Netherlands. The adjustments achieve strategic objectives without creating such massive French dominance that other powers feel compelled to form coalitions against Bourbon ambitions. Swedish compensation satisfies Stockholm's demands for rewards, while avoiding the creation of a Nordic empire that might threaten the balance the accord seeks to establish. Sweden receives Western Pomerania, including the crucial port of Stettin, along with the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden that provide access to North Sea commerce. These acquisitions transform Sweden into a significant German power, while maintaining the Baltic hegemony that Swedish policy has pursued since Gustav Adolf's reign. The 5 million thalers that Sweden receives as military compensation helps finance the transformation from wartime to stable economy. The constitutional revolution within the Holy Roman Empire proves as significant as any adjustment, fundamentally altering the relationship between imperial authority and princely autonomy that has generated conflict since the Reformation began. German princes receive the right to conduct foreign policy, including alliance formation with external powers, provided such agreements do not target the emperor or empire directly. This provision acknowledges the reality that centralized imperial control has become impossible, while creating legal frameworks for the decentralized system that warfare has already established. The principle of state independence that emerges from the negotiations will revolutionize international law by establishing the concept that legitimate governments possess supreme authority within their boundaries, immune from external interference in their internal affairs. This innovation challenges medieval concepts of universal authority while providing legal justification for the theological and administrative diversity that military force has been unable to eliminate. Independence becomes the organizing principle for a new international order, based on negotiated coexistence rather than imposed uniformity. Dutch autonomy receives formal Habsburg recognition after 80 years of intermittent warfare that began with the revolt against Philip II's attempt to impose Spanish authority over the prosperous northern provinces. Spanish acknowledgement of Dutch legitimacy eliminates the legal fiction that the United Provinces remain rebellious subjects rather than a legitimate government, opening the way for normalized commercial and relations between former enemies. The recognition validates the principle that successful resistance to established authority can create new legitimate governments when sustained over sufficient time. The exclusion of certain powers from the negotiations reveals the limitations of any accord, however comprehensive its apparent scope. England's absence reflects the civil conflicts that prevent coherent foreign policy during the 1640s, while Ottoman exclusion demonstrates continental reluctance to acknowledge Islamic legitimacy, despite Turkish control over substantial lands. Russia's non-participation reflects geographical and cultural distances that separate Muscovy from Western systems, creating gaps in the agreement that future conflicts will exploit. Economic provisions address commercial disruptions that have contributed as much to suffering as direct military action, establishing principles for trade restoration that transcend traditional boundaries. The documents guarantee freedom of navigation on major rivers while prohibiting discriminatory tariffs that favor particular nationalities over others. These commercial arrangements prefigure the international economic cooperation that will characterize later continental development, recognizing that prosperity requires coordination between independent entities. The question of war, damages, and reparations creates complex problems that negotiators resolve through practical compromises rather than abstract principles of justice. The mathematical impossibility of compensating all legitimate claims forces delegates to prioritize stability over individual redress, accepting that many victims will never receive adequate compensation for their losses. This pragmatic approach establishes precedents for future post-war agreements that emphasize forward-looking reconstruction over backward-looking punishment. Amnesty provisions attempt to heal the wounds that 30 years of confessional and administrative warfare have inflicted on continental society by offering forgiveness for actions committed during the conflict, regardless of their legality under previous arrangements. The general pardon extends to soldiers who served various masters, civilians who supported different causes, and officials who administered regions for competing authorities. This sweeping amnesty recognizes that successful resolution requires forgetting as well as forgiving, deliberately obscuring the complex loyalties and betrayals that characterize the conflict. The restitution of displaced populations poses enormous practical challenges as hundreds of thousands of refugees seek to return to homelands that may no longer exist or welcome their presence. Confessional minorities face particular difficulties when attempting to reclaim properties in areas now controlled by hostile faiths, while exiles discover that amnesty does not necessarily mean restoration of previous status. The documents establish procedures for handling these cases, while acknowledging that complete justice remains impossible given the scale of displacement and destruction. Gender roles undergo subtle but significant changes as the accord acknowledges female rulers' legitimacy in cases where male lines have been extinguished during the conflict. Several German regions pass to female heirs whose rights receive international recognition, creating precedents that expand women's participation beyond traditional limitations. These adjustments reflect practical necessities rather than ideological commitments, yet they establish legal frameworks that future generations will expand. The transformation of military organization reflects broader changes in continental structure, as professional armies replace feudal levies throughout most areas covered by the accord. Standardized recruitment, regular pay, and disciplined service become normal expectations rather than exceptional innovations, creating military establishments that serve state interests rather than personal loyalties. This professionalization reduces the likelihood that commanders will pursue independent objectives that threaten civilian authority. Local implementations of the principles vary significantly as individual regions adapt general provisions to specific circumstances that central negotiations could not address in detail. Some areas achieve smooth transitions to post-war arrangements, while others experience continued conflicts over property rights, confessional practices, and administrative jurisdictions. The flexibility built into the agreement allows for diverse interpretations while maintaining overall structural coherence. The cultural impact extends far beyond immediate arrangements as continental intellectual life adjusts to realities that challenge traditional assumptions about theological unity, administrative authority, and social organization. The acceptance of permanent confessional division encourages development of concepts like toleration and pluralism that medieval Christianity had rejected as impossible contradictions. These intellectual adaptations lay groundwork for Enlightenment thinking that will transform civilization during the following century. Artistic responses to the conflict's end reflect both relief at tranquility's arrival and trauma from experiences that have exceeded normal human endurance. Painters, writers, and musicians create works that capture the horror of war while celebrating the possibility of renewal that successful negotiations have provided. These cultural expressions help process collective trauma while establishing new aesthetic traditions that incorporate warfare's lessons into continental artistic development. The demographic recovery that begins after 1648 demonstrates society's remarkable resilience, despite the catastrophic losses that the conflict inflicted on virtually every region. Birth rates increase rapidly in areas where security returns, while migration patterns redistribute population from devastated lands to regions that offer better opportunities. This recovery process takes decades to complete, but ultimately restores population levels while creating new patterns that reflect post-war arrangements. Commercial revival follows stabilization as merchants re-establish trade networks that warfare had disrupted or destroyed entirely. The Hanseatic League adapts to new realities, while Italian city-states adjust their operations to accommodate French control over Alpine passes. Dutch commerce expands dramatically as independence removes Spanish restrictions, while English trade begins recovering from Civil War disruptions. These economic developments demonstrate how accord enables prosperity that military victory alone cannot achieve. The establishment of permanent missions reflects the new international system's emphasis on continuous negotiation rather than episodic conferences that had characterized earlier continental relations. Resident ambassadors become normal features of major capitals, while immunity receives formal recognition that protects international communication, even during periods of tension. These institutional innovations create mechanisms for managing conflicts before they escalate into warfare. Educational reforms accompany administrative changes, as universities adapt their curricula to address new realities that classical education had not anticipated. Law schools begin teaching international law, while military academies incorporate lessons learned during the recent conflict. These educational adaptations help prepare future leaders for the challenges that the new international system will present, ensuring continuity of institutional knowledge across generations. The accord concludes not merely a war, but an entire historical epoch, transforming the continent from a medieval world of universal authorities and confessional unity into a modern system of independent states and accepted diversity. The genius lies not in achieving perfect justice, an impossible goal given the scope of destruction and grievance, but in creating workable arrangements that enable former enemies to coexist without constant warfare. The principles established at Münster and Osnabrück will govern international relations for centuries, providing frameworks for managing conflicts between independent entities that claim supreme authority within their boundaries. As church bells ring across a continent that has rediscovered tranquility, civilization begins the long process of recovery from its most destructive conflict. The 30 Years' War ends where it began, with choices about confessional practice, administrative authority, and social organization. But the world that emerges from this crucible bears little resemblance to the medieval region that entered it. The modern international system has been born in fire and blood, tempered by suffering that has taught the value of compromise, the necessity of tolerance, and the wisdom of choosing negotiated solutions over military ones whenever possible. The war is over. The age of independent states has begun,